So this has been quite the week if we are following the news. One thing that we've seen a lot of in the last few weeks is a lot of negotiating of leaders of nations going before people of power to try to ensure the welfare of their own nation. And what we've seen is that this ends up being tricky business. It's not straightforward, and the stakes are really high. The future of whole nations, of whole people groups, are caught in the balance. There naturally then is a lot of anxiety all over the world right now about these meetings, about negotiations, about all these things taking place. But it might be somewhat comforting, just a little bit, to know that this actually has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. And that's what we see in this morning's reading from Exodus. We see Moses coming before Pharaoh and trying to negotiate with Pharaoh. And Moses ideally wants to negotiate freedom for the Hebrew people, but he knows that he can't just go ahead and say that to Pharaoh. So he has to kind of be a bit sly, and he has to say to Pharaoh, can we just take a 3-day journey into the wilderness so that we can sacrifice to our God? I mean, we all know that what Moses is really looking for, and the promise that the people of Israel are looking for, is for freedom. To be able to be released from slavery in Egypt, to be released from oppression, to be released from Pharaoh's rule, and be able to live their own lives. But they know that Pharaoh would never go for that. So they try to say, can we just go and worship God? Can we just go a 3-day journey away? Now, as we heard from last week, even just being there in front of Pharaoh takes a big step for Moses. He has to be called by God to get there. And it comes from this amazing encounter that Moses has with God, who speaks to Moses through a burning bush that never burns up. And in this encounter, Moses not only gets to know God, but he also gets to hear God's name. And so Moses enters into this deeper relationship with God through that experience and through that call, and then comes before Pharaoh to make this request. And so when Moses steps back into Egypt, he is no longer the prince who grew up in Pharaoh's household in the palace. He is no longer the rash young man who killed the Egyptian that he saw mistreating the Hebrew. He is now a shepherd, a husband, a father, and he becomes, for the Hebrew people, the closest thing that they have to a religious and a political leader. And we see that this has brought him in a different position. And so when he comes before Pharaoh, he's coming as a representative, not just political, but also religious. And even in this toned down request that he brings to Pharaoh, we hear how things do not go as hoped. Not only does Pharaoh refuse to let the people go sacrifice to their God, but he makes their lives much, much more miserable, increasing their workload, making them find straw now to make the same quota of bricks as was expected before. But it's important for us to take note that in this passage, Pharaoh gives 2 reasons for why he doesn't let the people go worship their God. The first one is Pharaoh says that he gives his refusal because of his own perception of God. He says, "Who is the Lord that I should heed his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. I do not know the Lord." This is significant because, if we remember in last week's passage, Moses spends all this time listening to God, hearing his voice, learning about who he is. Moses learns about God's identity. So Moses knows God, but Pharaoh does not. In fact, Pharaoh would have seen himself as being somewhat divine. He would have been considered the link between the Egyptian gods and humanity. And so Pharaoh would have seen himself as this kind of go-between, as somewhat divine entity. And so for Pharaoh to acknowledge another god that's not the Egyptian god that he's acting as the go-between, that's the Hebrew god, would be really something quite out of the ordinary. And Pharaoh is kind of also saying in that line, and saying, "I don't know God." This Hebrew God is also saying, I'm right here. Why don't you worship me? Is the underlying kind of story there. And the fact that Pharaoh has set himself up in the place of God, and that he does not know God and has no interest in knowing God, this is really important for the whole rest of the story. If we remember that the book of Exodus is calling people into a deeper relationship with God, then Pharaoh represents the opposite of that drawing in towards God. He is God's opposition. And if he doesn't know God at this point of the story, then as we dive into the passage more and more and dive into Exodus, we'll see how Pharaoh gets a master class in who God is and what power God has. So all the encounters that we have, the encounter we have this morning between Moses and Pharaoh, and the encounters that we'll see in the weeks to come between Moses and Pharaoh, from this point on, they're all our encounters where Moses, who hears God and knows God, and goes against Pharaoh, who does not know God and does not hear God. And as you may know from reading the story, or even seeing some of the Moses movies, the way that Pharaoh ends up getting to know God is rather dramatic and even horrific. It shows us that Pharaoh, though in all of this, is not just an innocent bystander in all that happens. He is a political leader who ruthlessly keeps the Hebrew people enslaved and overworked so that they will have no willpower to rise up against him. He is also a religious figure who sets himself up in direct opposition to the one true God, something that actually, as we'll see, isn't really recommended. But Pharaoh has another reason for saying no. He has another reason for not letting the Hebrew people go and worship their God. He says, "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get to your burdens." Then he adds, "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens." So his first reason is religious, and his second reason is practical and political. There is work for everyone to be done. The construction needs are urgent, and there's a cost to taking people away from this work. But there's also the fact that there are many Hebrews. The number of them is what worries Pharaoh. They need to be oppressed and subjugated so that he can remain in control of them. And we're told that later on the same day, Pharaoh tells the taskmasters to make the Hebrew people do the same amount of work, make the same amount of bricks, but without straw. So what that means for them is that they now have to go and scrounge around the ground and try to scrape up enough straw to make bricks. Obviously, it's an impossible task, and they're not able to complete their quota of bricks for the day. And so they're beaten for that, and they come, the leaders of the Hebrew people, the slave taskmasters, they come before Pharaoh and they complain to him about what's happening. It's not fair. They can't make the same quota of bricks. It's an impossible task, and they need Pharaoh to relent. But Pharaoh does not budge. In fact, he doubles down. He doesn't let the Hebrew people go to sacrifice their God, and he makes it harder for them to do their work, giving the bogus line that if they have time to think about worshiping their God, it's because they're lazy and they need more work. So the consequence for the Hebrew people is that they are forced into this impossible situation of having to do more work, having to be mistreated. So instead of bringing any kind of freedom or relief to the Hebrew people, Moses' first visit to Pharaoh brings nothing but more hardship. Not only that, but the people are now angry with him for meddling and making things worse. Brevard Child writes, "He is renounced by his own people, who would gladly trade the thought of freedom for a trade with the earlier status quo, which suddenly was made to feel quite tolerable." That earlier status quo, which suddenly was made to feel quite tolerable. I mean, you kind of see in what Pharaoh is doing here echoes of so many political leaders throughout the centuries, subjugating people, oppressing people, trying to make him think that, whatever came before was better, controlling them. And as Terence talked about last week, sometimes our callings are difficult, and this is what Moses encounters today. Actually, they're often difficult. We assume that if we are doing God's will and walking in his ways, that things will come together smoothly for us, and the plans that we lay out with God will succeed. But we see this morning That's not always the way it works, at least not at first glance. We can be called to do some very difficult things, and we may fail. Or maybe what we accomplish in God's name might appear like failure to the world's eyes. After all, we are today in the first Sunday of Lent, a season where we are journeying towards the cross. And what does the cross remind us of? It reminds us that Jesus, the Messiah, the hope of the world, dies. That's where God's calling led him. It's not the final destination, but that's what happens to him. We have no guarantee that our outcomes will be any better if we answer God's call. I'm sure that Moses was hoping that he could just walk into the palace, talk to Pharaoh, get permission to take the people out to sacrifice God, and that would be that. The hard part was that first encounter, so he thought. And God told Moses that Pharaoh would resist, but Moses probably just assumed that God would work it all out. So did Moses fail? It certainly seems that way. And he doesn't hesitate to take it back out on God, to say, look, you put me in this situation, you placed me here, it didn't work, it's made things worse for the Hebrews, you said that you were going to rescue us, and you're not doing it, you're not doing anything. What Moses is experiencing is that we can be called by God and fail. But we also don't see the full picture, and we don't know the how and why of God's work. There are many times when what seems like failure really isn't. We know in this story, we've read the story before, we've heard the story, we know that eventually Pharaoh will let the Hebrew people go. But God is at work even in these moments where everything seems to be crumbling apart. So does it mean that God is not at work, that he is not fulfilling his promises when we encounter hardship, setbacks, failure? Does it mean that our calling is invalid or a mistake? By no means. It means that we are not yet in the promised land, that we will face these hardships and setbacks and complications. It might feel like we're going through life on a higher difficulty settings at times than what we'd like. But regardless of what happens or what we go through, we have God's promise that he is with us. And that's what God promised to Moses before he left to see Pharaoh, is I will be with you. This is also part of the message of the cross, that there's no experience, no hardship that Jesus himself has not felt and endured on our behalf. Thomas Joseph writes, God does not spare from trial those to whom he reveals himself. On the contrary, God often wills or allows the multiplication of temporal trials so that the believers are encouraged to seek concertedly their refuge in God alone. We're encouraged to this, to seek our refuge in God alone. There are many things right now that are vying for our attention and for our refuge. We are asked to entrust our political leaders, to entrust different people in government to solve things for us. We are being faced with very real possibilities right now of economic hardship, and there are some religious undertones even to the discussions that are taking place. And no matter what side of the border or what side of the issues we find ourselves on, we may feel as hopeless and helpless as the Hebrews, trying to make bricks with less straw. But success isn't actually what we're looking for. It's not what God is looking for in us. God is looking for faithfulness. He's not looking for everything to turn out all right for us. He's looking for us to respond to our callings, even if they are mundane or repetitive or fraught with failure. Moses will go back to Pharaoh again and again and again. What we might think of as constant exposure to shame and failure is actually faithfulness. In the hours before his crucifixion, Jesus will go back and forth between political leaders, unable or unwilling to plead his case. What seems like failure is really faithfulness and obedience. And in each situation, despite the human political and religious machinations, God himself is revealed. That is the purpose of our calling. That is the purpose of our lives, to hear God, to know God, to point others to God, to worship God and praise him for the glimpses of him that we see, and most importantly, to rely fully on him. Political leaders, thankfully, will come and go. Our causes for anxiety in this world will come and go. Our savings, our bank accounts, will come and go. Our times of hardship will come and go. But what God says to Moses in the burning bush and what Jesus says to those who follow him remains the same. I am with you always.